was at that time non-compliant with their legal COVID-19 immunization bylaw that they initiated after I had joined and signed. They were going to take immediate action against those physicians who had not complied. The letter I wrote in the fall of 2021, which was, not just to draw attention to the issue with respect to kids and, was I actually putting my patients at risk?
You had all your chips in the middle, like you had it all in, because you're risking your license, also your primary income, everything.
It was an extremely stressful time. I sent that letter directly to every council member of the college. Nobody from the college has ever responded directly. I got locked out, middle of December, midnight. Mm-hmm. I couldn't get into the children's hospital.
You mean physically locked out?
Physically locked out. And then within 24 hours, I lost access, or very quickly there, access to the medical record. I couldn't even log in. The college sent in 2 investigators to go through my medical records to see if I had written vaccine exemption letters, because they had received, suspicion or a complaint that I might be writing these things. One of the pediatricians was informing all the other pediatricians that if you write a vaccine exemption letter for COVID, you are going to feel the wrath essentially of the college.
And then also too, isn't there also room for the fact that if they just don't want to get something, they have the right to always say no?
That's right. Patient autonomy, informed consent. You could completely disagree with them. And the big pharma influence is not just at the local children's, which it really is, not just at the universities, it's not just at the colleges. It goes, right to the very World Health Organization, which is a subset of the United Nations.
We had all of our leaders saying, this is safe and effective. It will stop transmission, vaccine. I was under the impression, probably majority of us, that there was, when you call it a vaccine, the same testing goes into it. So why was it not a vaccine? Hey, well, welcome citizens. So glad you guys have joined us today. We got Dr. Eric Payne joining us today, and he is a Canadian pediatric neurologist researcher, studied at the U of C, at Harvard, at the Mayo Clinic. Probably one of the guys that is speaking out, especially when it comes to the COVID vaccine, specifically in pediatrics and in children. So glad to have you. Thank you for joining us today.
Welcome. Thank you for the invite. Glad to be here.
Anything else we should tell our audience about you?
No, I'm also, happily married with 3 young kids. So that's been the driving force behind, a lot of the reasons for doing this. Yeah. I trained at the places you stated, including the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, where I did a pediatric neurocritical care and epilepsy fellowship. And then I was on staff at Mayo Clinic doing epilepsy, neuroinflammation, ICU EEG monitoring at Mayo for 6 years, and got recruited back to the children's pretty aggressively. Every year they kind of called to kind of consider, but I had dedicated 5 years is what I committed to Mayo. They recruited me back on a package which included 50% protected time to develop a neuroinflammatory clinic for kids with refractory epilepsy, and to build their neurocritical care ICU EEG monitoring program. There was sort of a 3-year package there, including the startup funding. And then 2 years into that, is when I was told I wasn't going to be allowed to continue with that contract. But my family and I had moved here back to Calgary. I did do residency and medical school here in Calgary. So the people knew me very well. We were here in February 2020. So it was a month later that the COVID pandemic hit.
Wow.
Yeah. And at that time, my kids were 3, 5, and 7.
Okay. Wow. And we're going to get into it already, because you said that your contract was essentially pulled halfway through. Why was that?
Well,
before we get too far though, I want to say, first of all, we really wanted to do this show for so many reasons. We just finished actually covering a show about the Freedom Convoy, and I actually just found out you were at the Freedom Convoy too. I saw actually where you spoke on the stage there. But to our viewers, to the citizens watching, the reason we wanted to talk about this is like the data is out and not enough people are talking about the data now. And so David and I, we're both fathers, 3 kids. You mentioned you have 3 kids, Dr. Eric, and we've got to talk about this. We got to make sure that the repercussions don't just get buried under the rug, because the data was what was, we hoped that the data was driving decision makings. I don't think it was in a lot of cases. There was actually a lot of fear and a lot of politicians, I think, trying to actually get their seat back for their next upcoming election. And so they were actually operating out of fear. So
no, they don't operate that way, do they?
No, never. So anyway, to the citizens, to the people watching, we are going to try to objectively look at this through a lens with an expert next to us here who's been through it all, who's been questioned, who's been in scenarios that we've never been and never seen. And so that's the whole premise here. Sorry to interrupt you. And
no, you're good. But to add on that, the conversation is important to have. And
Absolutely.
Jeremy and I, we're not experts. That's why we have you on the show, because you can put language to probably what a lot of us normal people in this area have gut feelings about, or maybe we don't know how to quite articulate it. We just know something's off, or that doesn't seem right, or something's strange. But we're so glad you can join us, because you can put language and obviously with the background that you have, you're highly qualified to speak on this. And then also on that front, you mentioned it's important to keep the conversation alive so we don't repeat mistakes that we've had in the past. And we go back to where we were. So we're going to go through the COVID vaccine. Is it a vaccine? We're going to be going through, is it safe for children? Do children even need it? We're going to talk about probably the double standard that was lived throughout the COVID world. I'm sure we'll get to a lot of other areas. But Dr. Eric, let's go back to the beginning. You mentioned when you were brought back to Calgary here on a contract, from my understanding, during COVID, that was basically stopped. Tell us why. That's the beginning.
Yeah. So ultimately, you get recruited back, sort of 3-year recruitment, and that's sort of your trial period. If things go sideways, they reserve the right to let you go. But the reality is, that on a year-to-year basis, they're renewing your contract. So the official language is, they chose not to renew the contract, despite the fact a few months later, evaluation across all areas was just, fine, of course. So the reason specifically, that was dropped was because I was at that time non-compliant with their illegal COVID-19 immunization bylaw that they initiated after I had joined and signed.
Okay.
They were going to take immediate action against those physicians who had not complied middle of October 2021. But that got delayed until about mid-December. And so on January 6th, after I had been locked out of the children's, they sent a letter saying, we're not going to renew your contract. Now, that bylaw was in place for 6 weeks, so by the end of it, we were allowed back with testing 6 weeks later. And so, of course, I sent them a letter saying, no, it's kind of a moot point right now, guys. But they said, we're going to stick to it at that point. And so I think at that point, it becomes pretty clear that the ongoing speaking out on behalf of the kids with regard to this issue became the main reason not to let me back onto that, lucrative contract, which included, protected time for research. As I was allowed back in, fee for service, and then gradually had my epilepsy time kind of taken away and then, sort of pushed out. And, so that's ultimately the case. I mean, if I had, I think, repented right at the beginning, sorry, I wrote this letter, forgive me, I'll take the shot, this would have all gone away. I think, possibly even if I just had stopped talking about the issue with kids. But the problem was that, the letter I wrote in the fall of 2021, which was, not just to draw attention to the issue with respect to kids and, was I actually putting my patients at risk? It was because the college itself in Alberta was contemplating making it part of my license. So I wouldn't be able to have an Alberta license, period. So I've been more working as a neurologist in the community now for about a year. Okay. Because so I'm not using my neurocritical care skills. I'm not using my epilepsy surgery evaluation skills. So, that part of it is, you can still hopefully coexist outside of it.
You had all your chips in the middle, like you had it all in, because you're risking your license, also your primary income, everything.
It's it was an extremely stressful time. You get very emotional when you get some of the, especially the trucker stuff, right? It was pretty crazy. But my brother asked me this just yesterday. He is, he actually has a federal government job and he lost his job temporarily because he refused a jab. He had a 1-year-old son that they were trying to support for at the time too. So he's got a human rights violation complaint going in, and it looks like there's going to be, conciliation on that. And he's been back working, pretty egregious. So a lot of us did exactly that same thing. But, you know, ultimately when the data is what it is and you can understand it and articulate it, and that initial letter was basically questions, you know, listen, if I'm going to,
the letter you wrote,
the letter I wrote in the fall of 2021, you know, it was 20 pages, 90 references. If I'm going to lose everything that I've worked for to this point,
answer my question.
You know, let's talk about this. And more importantly, never mind that. I mean, that means that if you can't answer this, then you're going to be causing more harm.
Did you get a response at all?
So not directly. You know, that letter was initially sent. Well, maybe not completely true, but I sent that letter directly to every council member of the college into their email box. Nobody from the college has ever responded directly. You could certainly say that, you know, 6 complaints over 2 years that have occurred subsequent for non-particularized misinformation, among others. A complaint was opened when the Children's Hospital and the Alberta Health Services took immediate action against me and locked me out of the hospital. The college opened a complaint because of that, for instance. I was investigated while I was locked out for writing vaccine exemption, COVID-19 experimental genetic injection exemption letters.
And just, I want to bring some context here. You are qualified to make those exemptions, and you are making, like, with your expertise, you're making decisions on these things, and then they're complaining against you. Is that accurate?
No, so this is actually, this is a, you know, I'll give you an anecdote here on this issue that shows you exactly sort of what, so when I got locked out, you know, middle of December, midnight, I couldn't get into the Children's Hospital.
You mean physically locked out?
Physically locked
dead.
out. You know, and then within 24 hours, I lost access, or very quickly there lost access to the medical record. I couldn't even log in electronically to, and so, you know, you can imagine the stress this put on the division. You know, we were undermanned a little bit at that time, anyways, and all of a sudden, these people are having to scramble to fill my spot on the call schedules, and my outpatient clinic, so on and so forth. But yeah, they, you know, so they took immediate action. They locked me up. The very next morning, and I testified to this with the receipts at the National Citizens Inquiry and the Red Ear testimony. The college sent in 2 investigators to go through my medical records to see if I had written vaccine exemption letters, because they had received, you know, suspicion or a complaint that I might be writing these things, right? You know, you got to go back a couple of weeks earlier and I've got this on video, where during one of our pediatric town halls at Alberta Children's Hospital, the person, one of the pediatricians, was informing all the other pediatricians that if you write a vaccine exemption letter for COVID, you are going to feel the wrath, essentially, of the college. There is no reason to be writing these exemption letters, is what they said. And if you do, you're going to be in trouble. But if you, and so they talked about, and so, you know, when you hear that, you're thinking to yourself, well, this is completely nonsense, because like every single specialist at the Children's Hospital has got a handful of kids who don't take the normal vaccine schedule now. Many of whom have had injuries, time-related injuries. You know, autism came in shortly thereafter, epilepsy, or, you know, just bad reactions to these things. Because some of the kids we see have got inborn errors of, you know, how you handle inflammation and infection. So we all have a handful of kids. So the kids that I selected on were some of them were the same kids who had these exemptions for years. By my, you know, and I inherited a whole bunch of these kids, as I said, in the last year. So 3 of the kids I think I wrote exemptions for had been getting exemptions written for all their vaccines from my predecessor for
totally
decades.
Fine beforehand. No issue.
Everything was fine. Everybody, you know, these are all of a sudden they're being told and scared not to do that. So I went and I looked at the college's website, and on the college's website, there was an exception to this rule. At the time, you could not get an exemption on the first shot. That just was not allowed.
Okay.
The only exemption you could get was if you had heart inflammation or you developed an allergic reaction after the second shot. So the only only medical history thing you could have that would, you know, give you an exemption was if you had a really bad reaction to the first one. That was essentially it. So there was no.
So take the first one, see what happens. There was absolutely, and then we'll consider.
Exactly. And only, you know, your adverse reaction was only those 2 specific things. When you go into the college website, you know, they had an exemption for this stuff, because I had, as I said, all these kids. You know, I've got these extremely rare medically refractory epilepsy patients where inflammation matters. You know, as I said, I was brought here to start a neuroinflammatory clinic. So if you're going to put this there, and so, then you're looking at the risk benefit, right? And so anyways, there was an exemption letter to be filled out that you could go through. So I used that, I provided the details to the family, and the family made an informed decision based on that choice. And in that letter, in those exemption letters, in my chart, I documented the crap out of it because I figured, of course, these guys are going to come back and look at my charts.
And then I also too, isn't there also room for the fact that if they just don't want to get something, they have the right to always say no?
That's right. Patient autonomy, informed consent, do no harm. These are, bedrock principles of medical ethics that have been steamrolled over that time. So yeah, you could completely disagree with them. And, there, in many circumstances, even as a physician who's overseeing, you have no choice but to go through. But this was one of those circumstances where that was changed. But just to fast forward to, to what ended up happening. So they sent the investigators in, they went through about 100 charts. They found 8 exemption letters or something like that, maybe less. The numbers might be a little bit off. 2 days, 2 investigators going through this. The geography is such that all the people in neurology, neurosurgery, physiatry, rehab, and all the affiliated medical staff are all in the same area, and our medical records are right in the middle. So everybody knew that I was locked out, and the college had sent in investigators to go through these investigations. So I found out about this investigation when I was in Ottawa, early February. We're still at the Truckers Convention, and I got a letter from the college stating that they had investigated this and that they were closing the investigation because they deemed all the letters, valid and well documented. And I had put we'll revisit this in a year, and the pros and cons seem to outweigh this specifically for these kids. I even in one of these kids, super rare condition called FIRES, which I had been involved with at Mayo Clinic, febrile illness-related epilepsy syndrome. These normal kids developing normally get an infection, and then a couple of days later, boom, epilepsy starts, kicks in, seizures. They end up in the ICU. We just can't stop these seizures. This is an extremely rare epilepsy, but it was still more common than dying with or from COVID as a pediatric age person, right? So it was pretty obvious, and the people ultimately pushing the jab at my hospital had very obvious, clear academic and financial conflicts of interest. I mean, you can find articles. The True North did an article on the main individual pushing the COVID shots at the Children's Hospital. And he'd received millions of dollars from big pharma, including Pfizer, over the 5 years preceding COVID. Now, this doesn't go into his pocket, and he doesn't buy a new house with this. 30% of that goes to the university. They take in direct costs. And then that goes to funding his in addition, he was the primary investigator on the Moderna trial because, this trial happened in multiple centers, so the 5 to 11-year-olds. So, you got career conflicts of interest and you got financial conflicts of interest.
He was an investigator, you're saying?
So he was one of the primary investigators on the trial at the Children's Hospital participated in the Moderna 5 to 11-year-old randomized control trial. So they had some patients, I don't know how many, but in that official trial that came from the Children's. He was one of the primary investigators on that. And in the 5 years leading up to COVID, he had received, as I say, I think the number was 2 or 3 million from Pfizer, 5 million total from big pharma. That article I spoke to and I put up in my discussion under oath in the National Citizens Inquiry. The other main, and this guy, just to speak to the power of that, because, ultimately the big pharma influence is not just at the local children's, which it really is. It's not just at the universities. It's not just at the colleges. It goes, right to the very World Health Organization, which is a subset of the United Nations. It seemed like very top-down policy that came rushing through. But the other, the particular individual had been the head of pediatrics for a long time. He was a pediatric infectious disease doctor that's well respected. But I laid the chips out, as you said, with respect to the facts and the data. I'm a facts-driven person.
I hope all doctors are.
And instead of getting a rebuttal on the science, what we got was defamation, censorship, and a beatdown. And I had the benefit, you asked if I ever got a response. So nobody at the college ever responded. Yeah. I also sent that letter to the CEO of Alberta Health Services, Dr. Verna Yu at the time. She's been fired. The person she forwarded it to was Dr. Mark Joff. Dr. Mark Joff is our current Chief Medical Officer of Health. He was like her number 2 or something science-wise at Alberta Health. He's the only person that responded to my letter. And he wrote a small letter back, which I really appreciated. I've posted that letter at my testimony as well. Basically, thank you, Dr. Payne, for your letter. We take your concerns seriously, blah, blah, blah. Second paragraph, everybody else in the entire world is doing this. We're going to do this too. Third paragraph, if you have concerns about the mRNA shots, which was Pfizer and Moderna, maybe you'll consider the DNA vector shots, the AstraZeneca and the J&J. The J&J is probably the one that caused the most harm out of all 4 shots based on the data, and both the AstraZeneca and the J&J are restricted in Canada because of how unsafe they are. Huh. So the response that I received was basically 2 fingers in the air, go take this DNA shot, and these have been subsequently withdrawn, and our current premier still has this guy as our chief medical officer of health.
Do you think that? I'm struggling to understand why so many doctors weren't. I always hope doctors were objective. I always hope they're investigating, fact driven. And what do you think was happening? Do you think they were so busy and so in what they do that they don't even have enough time to ask questions and dig in like some would? Like
that's
what's
absolutely
causing
part
this?
of it.
Yeah,
no, that's absolutely part of it. Is physicians are burnout is an extremely real thing. I mean, when I was at Mayo Clinic, something like a third of the neurologists had, every year they surveyed for this stuff were positive for burnout, which is basically a clinical depression at work.
Yeah.
And they had programs in place to try to help fix that. That was before I even joined Calgary. Well, I can tell you after a year of pandemic that, that burnout is way over 50%, right?
For
so
sure.
People are depressed, and you're so overwhelmed with all the administrative stuff that the idea that you're going to go in and investigate some of these things on your own, that's for sure part of it. The other part of it is, and I testified to this. This is in the mainstream media, but our military ran a PSYOPs operation against the Canadian population. That they specifically scared Canadians into that safe and effective narrative. There's an article in CBC that I cited, and then 6 months later, after they said they were going to shut it down, they were still doing it, right? So physicians were also susceptible to that narrative, right?
Yeah.
And we're generally people that will climb through the hoops that we have to climb through to get to where we are. We're very compliant people, and you have to also remember that we've got decades now where we've been trained that all vaccines are safe and effective. So when they were able to call these things vaccines, there was this these things are safe and effective because they're vaccines, right?
Yeah.
Which these things were never. They're factually not a vaccine.
Can you talk about that difference? Sorry to interrupt there. Mm-hmm. Why is this COVID vaccine? It was used. We had all of our leaders saying this is safe and effective. It will stop transmission. Blah, blah, blah. Vaccine. I was under the impression, we all, probably majority of us, that there was, when you call it a vaccine, the same testing goes into it. So why was it not a vaccine?
So if you have those slides, I'll show you a couple of hard data points on that. Because that was something I raised and I spoke about in the initial letter. My letter went out September 15th. On September 1st, the CDC changed the definition of vaccines. 2 weeks earlier.
It's convenient.
I want to see those 2 definitions. That's great.
Which slide do you want me to go to?
After disclosures, new definitions, Trump trial integrity.
Yeah, okay.
Wow.
If I turn my iPad sideways, does it change on there?
Yep.
Sweet, there we go.
You can also zoom in and it'll show you zoom in.
Right there. So, there's multiple sources you can find this. I had, initially in my letter, I cited the CDC website itself.
Yep.
On the left is Thomas Macy, one of the U.S. Congress people who, probably one of the only people standing up against this stuff. But yeah, you can see what's happened. So pre-2015 vaccination, prevents the disease. Between 2015 and 2021, they told us it produces immunity. But in September 21, what they changed, this is like,
from immunity to protection,
to providing protection, right? So
what does that mean?
Exactly. So so
Crazy.
That protection was a moving target, but the reality was, so And the CDC's got, and the World Health Organization, has a reputation for changing the definition on things, right? So one of the things I mentioned in the letter as well with the 2009 swine flu, which most of us can remember, because they tried to push a lot of fear on that and get a jab program. But the World Health Organization was successfully sued in court because they changed the definition of a pandemic during that time. They removed the quantification necessary. So if you're going to have a pandemic, you should be able to document that more people are dying than should be. Excess all-cause mortality should be increased. But they removed that. And the reason they removed that was because as soon as they were able to declare it a pandemic, it kicked in international deals sponsored on the shots themselves, right? And so they have the ability to do that. So here they are changing this to protection. But if you look at the right side of that screen, the reality is there was a whistleblower named Brooks Jackson, and she's alluded to up there in the British Medical Journal investigation. She was in the Florida site, was one of the recruitment centers for the original adult 40,000 patient trial. And she blew the whistle on all these egregious things that were happening, including unblinding and you got to remember that the margin of error of 40,000 people, they had 183 positive tests versus 3 or 5 in the unvaccinated, in the unvaccinated group, 183 positive tests in the original trial. The primary outcome was, positive tests plus some mild symptoms. And in the unvaccinated group, they only had 3 or 5. That's how they got the 95%, risk reduction, relative risk reduction number.
Yeah.
She's pointing out that there was massive fraud going on at her own collection site, which could easily switch the numbers 10, 15, 20, one way or the other.
Wow.
When she blew the whistle on that, within 24 hours, she was fired. The FDA was made aware and she was fired. So she went to court. This got into the British Medical Journal, and she lost a couple months ago. And the reason she lost essentially were twofold. One, the judge said, well, if the FDA didn't know about the problems in the trials before, they do now. And they're still licensing these things. So,
oh my gosh.
What an argument. And then the second one was essentially that the Department of Defense argued in that case that these things are not vaccines. These things are actually countermeasures. And the language and the definitions and the legalese behind this has been in place gradually over decades. So the people who have pointed to that very, very nicely have been Sasha Latipova, as well as this Bailiwick's Substack, who Catherine, I may call her name, I think Watts, but Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has had, has interviewed with these individuals, these ladies, and it's not like it's an opinion. What these people are doing are on their website. You can find it. They're showing you exactly where the legal changed. How did these things change? So the point is the case for corruption in the original trials was thrown out because the government knows about it now and they don't care. And 2, these things are actually legally countermeasures. So to call these things vaccine is actually factually incorrect. That's the data. And then they particularly don't like the idea that these things are experimental, right? They told us these things have undergone the same safety and efficacy trials that, the rigorous studies that Health Canada will do before they approve a drug, right? I mean, I've got that documented multiple times. We've got that on video. Many people in the Liberal government and Health Canada said this to us repeatedly, right? Okay. Well, I think that this may be, scroll down on this one. Keep going.
I got a video I want to show you.
This one right there
as well.
Yeah. Okay. Including you won't get COVID if you take the jab. So the reality is, if you look at that guy in the top right next to Grover, Anthony Housefather, he is a Liberal MLA. Yep. And not too long ago, he was answering questions because they were being forced to address the fact that the contracts remained not anonymous, but confidential. We couldn't see them. And this is, the video of this is hearing him say it himself is one thing, but I've just basically typed out what he said. And so he says these agreements need to remain confidential because the pharmaceutical companies need liability protection.
This just seems, sorry to interrupt, so backwards as a public servant who is sworn in to protect Canadian citizens, and yet his he is leaning to protect pharmaceutical companies over the integrity of what citizens are trusting him with. That's what when I read that and I get this across, well, it's like, where does your allegiance lie?
Well, he's basically stating, because these companies insisted on that liability protection. That contract is now actually, you can find it now, and you can see with the liability protection, what it was there. So the bottom line was, if you didn't agree to their demands, are you going to get vaccines, these experimental genetic jabs, into your country? And if these things are as safe and effective as they purport to be, and all of a sudden your citizens start to die because they didn't get it, you're going to look pretty bad. And the reality is, every country who went along with this signed a contract that way, right? But the point that I think that is so egregious is that they were telling us that they didn't skip any of these steps, right? And now under oath, they're saying, well, of course they had to skip these steps. These things were brought to market in less than a year.
Of course.
I mean, I've got articles in peer-reviewed media. We flew the plane. We were building the plane while we were trying to fly it. There's no question. You don't have to. Analogy. This was said by the Pfizer executive in charge of this stuff. This was her statement. That's how she described it herself. We had at the time, and this goes back to the experimental nature of these things. Sure, this technology, they've been working on this for a long time, but the reason it hasn't been brought to market is because it always hurts people, and so it's never successfully been brought in. And it's certainly never been brought in a mass situation in the middle of a pandemic to try to stop transmission. Something that these guys admit they knew it never did, even though they told us that it did stop transmission. That was one of the reasons that I was being fired, was because, well, you're not going to take something that's going to stop transmission. Well, you never actually stated that it was So we've got Janine Small, who's on that slide bottom left. That's the European Union. She's a Pfizer executive. No, we didn't know if these things stop transmission. We really moved at the speed of science. And then on the right side, Cecilia Lorenko, former premier Brian Preckford was among people who sued the federal government for violating their ability to travel freely across the country because of the vaccine mandates. So during testimony in that court case, this executive for Health Canada, admits that these things were never studied to stop transmission. The primary outcome measure was relative risk reduction. It was not even absolute risk reduction.
And that's not what we like when we go back to the news reporters. None of that was being said. Everything was just demonizing anyone who's unvaccinated, that you're killing people and you're the reason, and it was just fear.
But what was actually said, though, I feel I remember hearing, call them different leaders in our country, people with platforms, it stops the transmission. Take this because it stops the trend. Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, used the language of protecting your neighbor.
That's right.
Or there will be consequences if you don't, because they are so convinced, or however you want to put it, that this will stop. COVID.
So the lie on that one is egregious, because one, the truth is, that I just pointed out, it was never studied in the original trials to do that. And the second part, so that everybody in that top left, are just examples of people saying you won't get it if you take the shot. It stops transmission. It wasn't until August of 2021, but this was still August, not the fall when they forced the mandates, but early August, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, top right there, she admitted, what we know now is that these things don't stop transmission, but they still, will decrease illness severity. The reality is, FOIA documents now show emails with her and Fauci that they knew these things didn't stop transmission in January, February 2021. So for 7 months after that, she was lying to everybody about that. And then they finally had to admit it, because why do they have to admit it? Well, it was obvious. The numbers were blatantly obvious, right? But if you go down to the slide just underneath this was a poster that was circulated at the Children's Hospital that I worked at. It was, I think, probably other places too. Within Alberta, this the 19 to 0 campaign, this was pushed by one of the infectious disease doctors I alluded to, with a financial conflict of interest. But this was pushed in the summer and into the fall. But I can tell you, having had to bring my own daughter in with a broken arm to the Children's, that stuff was still up in the emergency department, well into the fall. The number of egregious statements made there, but to the point about the experimental nature of it, I have email confirmation with these individuals at the time, because they should have had 6-month safety data. The original trials were based on 2 months. We should have had 6-month data in the fall when they were pushing us into taking these shots.
So short-term data.
That's right.
And yet they were saying long-term statements.
Right. So I confirmed, because I'm like, well, these people are more in the loop maybe than I'm going to be. What do you guys have anything more than 2 months? And the response that I got from this doctor was that we've got 2 months in adults, right? And so everything that they say with respect to that long-term stuff, when they're telling parents these things are safe long-term, I mean, they didn't even have 6 months at that time. It was completely egregious to me making that comment. And, it turns out that the 6-month data, the FDA, not Pfizer, but the regulatory agency that approved these shots went to court to try to prevent the release of the 6-month data for 75 years.
Yes,
right. So nothing says safe and effective like hiding the data for 75 years. So what did that data show?
Everyone's going to die off before.
Exactly. This is basic logic stuff. Right?
For sure.
And if you're trying to combat vaccine hesitancy, right? Show us the 6-month data.
Sure.
But they couldn't. And the reason is, and Canadian COVID Care Alliance did a brilliant video on this stuff as well. But the numbers are actually worse than what they did in the video, because the pharmaceutical companies played some games with numbers and only brought in a whole bunch of other injuries after the fact. But we saw at least 6 more deaths in the vaccine arm, so including from COVID. So there were 6 more.
6 more than what was protected.
So if you looked at the vaccinated with the compared to the unvaccinated, from the original Moderna and Pfizer trials, this is the Pfizer one in particular. The 6-month data showed that there were 6 more deaths in the vaccine arm than in the placebo arm. More people died who received the jab than who received placebo. Yeah. And those deaths were, one was even a COVID-related death, which puts a pretty huge hole on, lowers serious illness and disease. But a lot of these were cardiovascular deaths, clotting, heart attacks, these type of things. And so, the FDA tried to prevent that data, and we've got lots of examples where they've gone to court to try to prevent these data from being released. So, that's what's being told to parents at the Children's Hospital. They're being gaslit if they choose not to take the shots, and that was the state of the evidence. So what did Pfizer do at 6 months? Because we should have, if you're not going to call these things experimental, at the very least, you've got to have, we expect 2-3 year follow-up data. Like a phase 3 trial should have 2-3 year follow-up data. That follow-up data was supposed to be available in fall 2022, fall 2023. Yeah. These pharmaceutical companies unblinded the trial at 6 months and gave the injection to the placebo arm. So we don't have.
You can't see the long term.
We don't have anybody in the original trial who long term, beyond 6 months, received the shots. We also have 0 long term data, from these things in terms of repeated shots, right?
Yeah.
So there's no way from the original trials to gauge this, and so you've got to rely on these passive surveillance systems, like Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS in the U.S., the Vigilance system in the European system, Vigi Access, which is the World Health Organization's own, and these things, I've got some of those slides too. They've got like signals that are just through the roof, right? I mean, the VAERS database, which is the adverse event reporting system in the States, which underreports these injuries massively. Study before this by Harvard, 1%
the critics for VAERS though often will say, well, anyone can report, right? And so they're saying anti-vaxxers could go on there and just, couldn't they? In theory.
Oh yeah, the VAERS stuff. I spent a full hour on this, but the bottom line with the VAERS, if you look at the adverse events that were reported in this thing, 80% of the reports were filled in by physicians, and of the injuries reported, these are all like 80% of them are within 48 hours to 5 days type thing. Wow. So you've got a time spatial relationship with over 80% of the reports that are in there. That's huge. And you've got, but what you also can do with VAERS, and this is another thing that the government went to try to prevent the release of, is that when people put their VAERS reports in, they also have a vaccine identification number, so you can sort of link these things.
Interesting. I didn't know.
This is how we've got some of the best data that we've got. There are studies showing that as increased levels of DNA contamination are included in these vials, which we know are there in the billions of copies, your risk of having an adverse event reported in VAERS has gone up as well. Wow. We know that about a third of these vials, don't seem associated with any adverse report at all. Yeah. We've got about a handful, small 1%, single digit percentage, about 4 or 5% that account for like 70% of all injuries. Like what looks to be bad batches type thing. So we learn a lot from these things. But the point is, in VAERS, you've got these commentaries, so you can pull these things out. You can pull out all the ones in kids, and you can see what did the person say, and you can clearly see. Took the shot, collapsed before I left the room. And then there's no doubt that these things are.
I want to show you a video because I wrote a few notes here, because what blows my mind here is there's so many layers of issues here. Like you said, changing definitions, which is such a wild variable. Imagine if you were being sued and you could change the definition of the thing you were being sued for. Like I can't even wrap my head around the fact that they can change definitions in order to allow them to just do what they're doing. And so that's, before you comment, sorry, and then reporting. So changing definitions and reporting. And then this video I bumped into yesterday, and it's all about reporting, but it scares the daylights out of me when you realize they'll report what they want. And here, I'm just going to try to connect to the screen.
Vaccinated a grand total of 1,131 kids. Maddie DeGarry, our client, is one of those children, okay? January 16th, this is her doing a TikTok video. And this is January 20th. She goes in for her second Pfizer dose, not as just a person in the public, as a clinical trial participant. Within 24 hours, she was in an emergency room, a cascade of emergency room visits that eventually resulted in her being in a wheelchair and have a feeding tube. She basically has a form of, neurological disorder, which is common type of injury, at least when there's a vaccine injury, right? So a lot of vaccine injuries that we deal with are immune or immune-mediated neurological issues, like Guillain-Barré syndrome, transverse myelitis. You can go down the list. It's basically where your immune system attacks your nerves. In the case of, for example, GBS, starts in your periphery. The real concern from a regulatory perspective is how the FDA dealt with it. Not in any way to minimize the pain and harm to Maddie. Pfizer reported Maddie's injury to the FDA as. They reported it as functional abdominal pain. They did not say she's in a wheelchair. They did not say she couldn't walk. They did not say she has a feeding tube. They basically said it's in her head and she got a tummy ache. What did Pfizer tell the public about Maddie? It says there were no vaccine-related serious adverse events in its trial. That's what it told the public.
And that's what I mean.
But that's not surprising that Pfizer would do that. It's complete self-interest and protection, right? It's about.
But these are the controlling interests.
That is a. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say on that case. That case had made public in the fall when they were trying to push these shots on our kids in the 2021. Yeah. Her mom had testified at U.S. Senate hearings. This is related to your question about definitions too. This is important because the original trials, as I mentioned, the adult trials for Pfizer and Moderna, looked as a primary outcome measure a positive PCR test plus some mild symptoms. In the kids, and that included 40,000 people, 20,000 who got the shot, 20,000 who didn't.
Yeah.
In the kids, the original trials had about 1,300 children. And so that would have been in the 11 to 18-year-olds. And the primary outcome was not positive PCR tests and positive symptoms, which has its own issues.
Yeah.
But it was, if I measure your blood 2 weeks later, can I see that there's an immunoglobulin and an immune response, an IgG response to the spike protein that gets produced by these jabs. And they could see that, if I shoot this into your blood, meaning, billions of copies of a genetic code to get your body to produce a foreign protein. Sorry, I just losing track on that, but
they're seeing if the body has an immune response to that.
They're just seeing if there's an immune response.
But wouldn't that happen if you injected just about anything?
That's my point. So they flood your body with this foreign thing, and then they see that this one marker goes up. Yeah. And Anthony Fauci himself has admitted that this, what they call immunobridging, or immunoreactivity, is not a valid clinical proxy for any sort of protection from the disease itself. They know this. It just. So that was what the approval on for kids was based on. Just 1,300 kids, and just whether or not it increased an immune response a couple of weeks later. Maddie was in that trial.
Yeah.
So she had a severe adverse event, suggestion that she had a lot complication, but suggested that there was a transverse myelitis inflammation down her spinal cord, which caused her to be the way she was. And so that would have been one very bad, serious adverse event in 1,300 in the original trial, right? Which, clearly exceeds, the risk from the virus itself, right? So they had to lie about this. So when you say, Pfizer had to cover it up, sure. The problem is the regulatory agencies were working hand in fist with these pharmaceutical companies at the time. And she was at one of the U.S. centers that had the primary investigator, or one of the main investigators that reported the final trial. So this guy who's a vaccine expert in the U.S. involved with this trial, it was his patient. He knew exactly what was going on when he signed off on this stuff. So there is so that was So when you look at if you go back to the poster, my slides there for a second. That poster that they circulated at the Children's,
this one here.
That's right. Our COVID-19 vaccination safe for children? That in the poster itself, that top left sort of box, it says safe and 100% effective. If you zoom in, it's in bold.
Sorry, which part of the screen?
It's on the right side of the screen.
Okay.
The top left, the first, right there. Our COVID-19 vaccine safe and effective.
There we go. Yeah.
So they told parents that this thing was 100% safe and effective.
No, this is when you say they, you're talking about Pfizer and Moderna, or
this poster
participating governing bodies too.
This poster was circulated at the Alberta Children's Hospital, and it was this 19 to 0 initiative. I would love to find out who all the people are involved and who funded this type of thing, but this is what Alberta parents were being told if they went into the Children's Hospital, and so. Bolded, safe, and 100% effective.
That's perfection.
And so that is based on in 100% of kids, there was an immune response 2 weeks later. But they're trying to push this at a time where we already knew that a lot of the adults and young adults who had taken the shots were getting sick.
Yeah.
When I wrote my letter in September 15th, 2021, we had
It's a year and a half after kind of COVID broke out.
Yeah, but it was, exactly. But it was within the first 3 or 4 months after the shots were available, right? In Canada, we got them like May, June, July. We got to 50% uptake in Alberta mid-June, mid-July.
Of 2021?
Of 2021.
Yeah.
That was in the adult group.
Okay.
Right. And so, they were, they continue to show that data, but and I've got those slides to sort of showed what happened with the effectiveness in time. And there's some really interesting things in terms of how they changed the definitions, because think about, I'm going to get sidetracked here, but think about what they defined as vaccinated, right?
Yeah.
You get 2 shots, 2 weeks post your second shot. If you weren't 2 weeks post your second shot, you got put in the bin as being unvaccinated.
Yeah.
So in the UK, there's been an inquiry into this stuff, and this has been admitted, and this is the case here as well. I'm sure of it. But in the UK, it's been proven and admitted that there are people who were in the bin of unvaccinated who actually died after the shot. And there's Alberta data that I present here as well that had that same phenomenon. If you go to there's a rainbow looking graph, so scroll down. Actually, let's just start right there at the top.
This one here?
Yeah. So this
Can I ask you a quick question before?
Yeah.
What is the chain of command, so to speak, for information? You got like the WHO, you got CDCs, you have these governing bodies that sounds like countries, or in our case, provinces. They probably get information and quote unquote data from. Everyone's influenced by someone. And it eventually gets down to your level, on the doctor level, right? In terms of how you guys are operating, you have recommendations, it sounds like, from the Alberta College of Physicians. Is that correct? Or they have guidelines on how you operate?
That's right.
And obviously, so I got 2 questions. My first question, can you help articulate the chain of command in terms of how information flows, which influences it on the ground level? And my second question is, why are you different than other doctors?